And Cheryl, I'm going to ask you if you're okay with it to
Yeah.
Introduce Brad.
Absolutely. So I guess I can't see you, Brad, but first off, I want to thank you, Brad, for being willing to come and speak. Brad is located in DC, and I was lucky enough to meet him in Churchill. We were on a similar trip looking at polar bears, which was awesome, and back in 2019. And Brad gave an excellent talk on aviation and its impact on climate, which is huge. And as we go forward, tonight he's going to talk about, as we kind of go back into flying a lot, how we can make a difference as individuals, the projected emission trends for the aviation sector, and what it looks like for policy in the future. So thanks so much. Brad is actually, he works for World Wildlife Fund and is director of carbon market governance and aviation. He has a very impressive resume. Brad, I don't know if you want me to go through all of this, but he speaks often at international conferences. He has a degree, MPA from Environmental Science and Policy from Columbia, International and Public Affairs, as well as a BA in International and Environmental Studies from the University of Oregon. I don't know if you want to say some other things about yourself, but I also want to introduce Grant Gilbert. I don't know where you are in the squares, who's our vice president. Are you vice president or director of development for World Wildlife Fund? And I've worked with Grant for about 7 years now, and Grant's out of Illinois. So that's the plus of virtual. We can have these awesome speakers sit in our living room. So anyway, Brad, maybe you could say a few more things about yourself before you start.
Yeah, happy to. And I guess first off, thanks for the invitation to speak. Really appreciate it. And you mentioned my BA from Oregon. It's actually where I'm moving back to with my family and driving across country in about, I guess, 2 weeks now. So yeah, I mean, with respect to how the climate's changed, I think we sort of realized about a few weeks ago when we were thinking about moving back, like, wow, Oregon really has changed over the last few years, just in terms of climate, right? We're going back to, the drought and wildfires, and this is going to be, expected, right, for quite a while, right? It was not really something we experienced when we were living there many years ago, but it is just part of reality. But I'm going to transition to talk about aviation here. And Cheryl, you mentioned we were in Churchill together, I guess 2 years ago now, or a little bit less than that. And the state of aviation was a little bit different than it is now, and in some ways very similar. And so I'll talk a little bit about things that are different and things that are the same, and the challenge ahead for the sector to be in line with a safe climate future. So I'll first give it a snapshot of WWF and just the work that we do and why climate is part of that. Again, I'll talk about what aviation's impact is on global warming, its share, that is, of the broader perspective from other, given other sectors and what they emit, and show you what aviation emits as well. And then to look at sort of, how to bring the sector in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? To make sure that they're a contributor to a safe climate future and not, that the sector doesn't continue to grow in an unsustainable way. I'll give a few examples of projects that we're working on, and then I'll end it off on more of a, not a personal note, but something that could, a lot of us could relate to. Just when you book a flight, like what goes through your mind, and how do you make the right environmental decision in that moment, right? So there's a term that we like to use. We say fly like a nerd. So I'll explain how we can all fly like a nerd at the end here. But so WWF, I mean, we're mostly known as a conservation organization, right? We're mostly associated with wildlife. That's a huge part of our DNA, right? And protecting the biomes in which wildlife relies. Working on making sure that food systems aren't, that we're able to feed the planet at the same time as making sure that we're able to conserve wildlife in our planet. Climate is a threat multiplier, right? As the climate warms, it threatens the places that we're trying to save even more. So we have staff that work on strategies to try to reduce emissions, or influence others to reduce emissions, but also to make sure that we're, adapting to what's happening currently, right, in our world, right, and the expectation that we have that there will be additional climate impacts that we'll have to adapt to. So both trying to address the problem, right, of climate, but also being ready to adapt and helping the places that we protect adapt as well. But onto climate, onto aviation, which is a small sliver of the climate program. But we've had an aviation and climate program since around 2008. I've worked on it personally since 2013. And it's 3% of global emissions today. And you might think that's kind of small, but it would be just above Russia in terms of global emissions, right? Or in terms of their rank among countries. So it is still a significant chunk. And then if you look at the full impacts of aviation on global warming, they're actually more. It's more like around 5%, perhaps even a little bit more than that, given recent science. And the reason for this is when you fly an aircraft in the upper atmosphere and you burn kerosene, jet fuel, up at that level, there's certain chemistry that creates a net warming effect that's even worse than what the CO2 is normally delivering. So it's just that effect of the global atmosphere of burning kerosene. And the sector is most likely to grow, perhaps even triple, maybe a little bit less than that, given the effects of COVID. I'll talk about that and how COVID has sort of, shifted the sector, not necessarily just for the short term, but even emissions trajectories in the future. But it could be a huge part of, global emissions as we look farther out. It's going to be taking more and more of our carbon budget as other sectors go down, as hopefully we're able to reduce emissions from electricity consumptions. And what that's going to do from a percentage perspective is make aviation a bigger part of the pie in future years. The equity issue is an interesting one. There's very few people that take flights, and even fewer that take international flights. And I think that this is just something to think about, as we fly, and that we have a lot of influence over the aviation industry in a way, right? If there is collective action, there's a lot of influence that we can have on airlines because they're very sensitive to margins, right? They have very small margins, so they really do have to listen to customers if they get mobilized. So just something to be thinking about. The other thing is that there's just a lot of innovation in aviation, and I mean, you sometimes hear about electric planes these days. One thing that I think is interesting is what are called syn fuels. These are fuels that are made from water, electricity, and carbon. Basically, you take water, electricity, and carbon, you turn it into hydrogen, you run a current through it again, and you create kerosene that if you design it in the right way, you could be pulling carbon out of the air and having a zero carbon fuel. So this was unheard of, just not talked about very much until around 2010 16, and now there's some real projects that are starting to get set up. So this is quite an exciting trend. I couldn't say this a couple years ago when I was in Churchill, but there really are some things happening in this space right now. So I mentioned COVID earlier and how that has changed the sector. You can see the dotted lines here. These were scenarios that were done by the aviation sector before COVID-19 hit. And you can see that these going up. But even, this is an industry assessment of growth in the future. And even the industry itself is saying that it's going to grow a little bit less. And so I think that that's overall a good thing, because you can't just depend on cleaner planes. You can't just depend on cleaner, sustainable aviation fuels being burned in planes. You do need to have a certain amount of decrease of growth from what was going to happen, because there wasn't really a chance for the sector to be in line with the Paris Agreement. So I think that in some ways, this is a good thing that COVID has affected the trajectory of aviation into the future, because it really has pushed business travelers and others to Zoom, right? I think it has fundamentally changed the way that we are thinking about business, and I hope that we're able to keep this trajectory because that does, excuse me. Yeah, have to step away here. Sorry about that. Got something caught in my throat. Because I do think it would have been very hard for the sector to do its part to stay in line with the Paris Agreement. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about approaches to cut emissions. I sort of alluded to it a bit earlier. And the way to think about this is we want to first avoid emissions in the first place. We want to take steps to reduce them. And then part of this framework is what I call compensation, or you're doing additional investments that are beyond the sector. It's not really reducing emissions, but they are. This sort of purple column is sort of a part of the framework when we talk about aviation emissions. So I'll get to that part in just a bit. But we first want to avoid, if possible, flights at all. So I think that is something that's happening now, and hopefully a little bit of those gains are locked in, given how I think COVID has shifted the sector. But we also need to make sure that there's policies that are pushing modal shift, like trains and in cars in certain cases instead of flights, right? We also need to make sure that there's policies that are pushing innovative aircraft design. Some of this is happening within the sector already, but when Boeing or Airbus want to make a new plane, it's extremely expensive. It's extremely risky. Every time they want to create a new model, there's a chance that they could go bankrupt, right? So this is a big, this is why government policy is so important when doing new plane designs, because if they don't have that, if they don't have the loan guarantees, if they don't have solid innovation investments that are funded by government, new plane models usually don't take off. So just something to think about. And then flight efficiency improvements, planes, there are things you can do in how you operate planes that where you can get efficiency gains and thus are burning less fuel. And then, of course, I think the big one is sustainable aviation fuel. And I'm going to skip ahead just a bit here to show you this graph to show you how important aviation fuels are, sustainable aviation fuels are for the sector. And that's this green wedge right here. And sustainable aviation fuels can be made out of a lot of different things. I think a lot of people will think of them as crop-based biofuels, but crop-based biofuels, that's not what I think the aviation industry is expecting to use, because I do actually think that the the airlines recognize that they don't want to be using palm oil fuels, right, which are come under a lot of criticism for actually increasing tropical deforestation more than they're actually saving emissions, which is absolutely the case in most cases. So I do think that they're thinking about these really advanced fuels that are made of waste gases, or syn fuels that I was talking about earlier, where you're harvesting carbon from the air and then running a current through it with water, turning it into hydrogen, and then turning into this syn fuel kerosene. So I think that's actually a very positive thing. And I'll go quickly back to this, which is the compensation column, compensate or invest beyond. And this is really, I'm sure that a lot of you have heard of this, it's offsets, right? Carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are pretty controversial. This is another area that I work in. And they're controversial for a good reason, because, sometimes they don't represent real emissions reductions. There can be some funny accounting with the different projects. That's not what happens in all cases. But there's certainly some abuse out in the system. I think there's a lot of innovation that's going on in this space right now that is recognizing that they can still be used in a positive way, though. Carbon credits are still a good thing if you buy the right ones. The real challenge with the concept of offsetting is that if an airline or any company didn't want to reduce their emissions, they could just buy offsets or carbon credits and not do anything. So we clearly don't want that to happen, right? But at the same time, you can't just immediately turn off the spigot of emissions, right? You can't just immediately stop flying. Or airlines won't immediately stop selling their services. They can't switch to sustainable aviation fuels. So these carbon credits are seen as sort of a bridge to, becoming more efficient over time. And so that's what you see under the curve right here, this gray. And you can see how the sector even recognizes itself that it will phase this out in a few years. There are some models that the aviation industry has themselves where they phase out in 2035 even. So, if it were up to them, I think that the sector would actually switch to aviation fuels if we have them, right? And that's the big question. Will we have enough of these sustainable aviation fuels in the future? I'm going to skip this just to keep moving here. And I'm going to talk about a couple things that WWF is specifically working on. One is something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is a program that WWF and World Resources Institute and an organization called CDP created back in 2015. And what this organization does is it helps companies understand what an ambitious climate reduction target is for their company. An ambitious target. So for many years, companies have been setting goals to reduce their emissions. Science-Based Targets Initiative is a standard that says, okay, you're an airline, for example. Well, given that you're an airline, you need to reduce your emissions in this trajectory, right? If you're an electricity company, if you're a power producer, you need to reduce them in a more steep fashion than the aviation industry because you have more technologies available for you to do that, right? So it's this whole organization, Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is helping companies understand how to set those targets and align them with, in a scientific way, with a 1.5 degree Celsius trajectory. So over the last year, in 2020 and a little bit in 2021, we created a methodology for aviation. So I think in about a month, we'll release this, and airlines will now be able to set targets under this initiative. We haven't had this before. And so I think it could be quite interesting. I think there will be some airlines that will set it. and or set targets under the initiative. And what we found with other sectors of the economy when they have science-based targets is that it really does energize transformation within a company. So we're really excited about that happening. And there are some currently there are some really great things that airlines are doing in terms of investing in sustainable aviation fuel. So here's a really good one from United. Here's a really great announcement from Alaska. Check mark here on JetBlue. This happened just, I think, 2 days ago, where they invested in some sustainable aviation fuel projects to fuel planes in LA that they have. And then United, I think today, actually, yeah, this is July 14th. I just clipped this today. They're investing in electric plane startup. They're going to have 200 electric aircraft, they think, in the future. But this one was not quite the best announcement from United. And this one worries me quite a bit. We haven't talked about it yet. And it's supersonic travel. So it's quite contradictory. What United is doing is they're investing in sustainable aviation fuels. They're investing in electric plane startups. But they're investing in supersonic travel. Well, it's really cool to go fast. I would love to go faster, but the issue is that they're at least 5 times more wasting of carbon than your normal subsonic jet, like a 737. They could even be worse than that. They could be up to 12 times worse than your normal subsonic aircraft. So this is quite worrisome, and I hope that other airlines do not adopt this pathway, because it does, like, I don't think United could set a science-based target, which I was just talking about, if they have supersonic aircraft in their fleet. So yeah, something to look out for. But we were just talking about voluntary initiatives right there. Where we actually try to put most of our effort is into policy, because we do believe in voluntary action within WWF as a way to push innovation. But in the end, we should be looking for policy, because that's how you really get scale, right? That's how you really get transformational change. And under the new administration, some new opportunities began to open up. And one was, and it started to open up a little bit before, but as senators and representatives started writing legislation, or basically doing pre-drafts of legislation when they felt like the administration could change over to a Democratic one, and they wrote the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Act. And this is a House bill. I think there will be a Senate. I think there is a Senate version of this released by Senator Whitehouse from Connecticut. But this is really a really great act, and it has some wonderful provisions in it that are incentivizing sustainable aviation fuels. One is a tax credit that would give airlines $1.50 a gallon if they're buying fuels that are reducing emissions 50% more than normal kerosene they would buy. And they get even more, up to $1.75 if they buy syn fuels. The syn fuels would give you 100% reduction. So the syn fuels that I was talking about earlier. So this could be really, really great for the sustainable aviation fuel industry. And then there's a couple other provisions there on research, which would be wonderful. And then a fuel standard, which would even be more impactful than this blender's tax credit. So that's just something to look out for as Congress continues to legislate this year and maybe into next year. I hope that some of these provisions, these 3 provisions get passed through a bill, whatever vehicle that will be in Congress. So this is my final slide, and I'll turn it over to questions. I'm going to teach you how to fly like a nerd. So flying like a nerd, my colleague from an organization called the International Council on Clean Transportation came up with this a couple years ago. And he did it because he realized, there's not really a good framework out there that helps customers think about how to make good decisions when they fly, or when they might fly, right? So I actually added the A on this. So this is a sort of a shared effort. I added the A here because he had just nerd. So the first step is to, if you can avoid the flight, do that, right? Now, if it's leisure travel, the whole point is to fly, so that doesn't necessarily make sense in that context. But for business travel in particular, the A is quite important, right? If you can avoid the flight in the first place, that's the best thing you can do. But if you do fly, you should think about flying a newer aircraft. So, that will require a little bit of research into what the newer aircraft are, but, of the Boeings, anything after 67 is pretty good. So 777, the Boeing 787, Airbus planes like the A320neo or the A321 are much more efficient than planes that came before them. The next thing you should think about is how you fly. Economy, first class, business. If you fly economy, it is significantly less fuel per passenger that's burned. There was a report released about a month ago that showed that from the International Energy Agency that showed that a really important lever for reducing emissions from flight will be to take some of the first class out, actually, because they really do waste a lot more fuel when you're not packing more people in. And I know that we don't like to get packed in, but from an efficiency perspective, it is something to think about as you fly. And then the final two are regular, which is that basically means that if you have a choice between a really small plane and a mid-sized plane, pick the mid-sized plane. If you're going to fly a really big plane or a mid-sized plane, pick the mid-sized plane. So basically mid-sized planes are just more efficient. If you're too big, you're going to be burning too much fuel. If you're too small, you have fewer people packed in there, and just the per unit of CO2 that's expended, it's more than it would be than if you're picking like a 737 or a A320neo. So, and then finally here, the last thing you can do is to fly direct. So stopovers, in most cases, a stopover will mean more emissions because a plane will use more emissions on the way up because of takeoff, right? Than it does at cruise. Cruise altitude, it's really not using that much fuel at all, right? Still a lot of fuel, but not as much as takeoff and landing. Landing too is not very efficient. So because of that, if you can buy a direct flight, that's the best way to go. So on that note, I will end and looking forward to answering any questions you might have.
All right, thank you. That was excellent. As a former very aggressive business flyer, having flown probably 60% of my work life for the past 20 years, and certainly Zoom and the pandemic has had a huge impact on that last year. It's interesting to see now, though, that almost all of this resurgence in air travel is leisure travel right now, and it's filling whatever capacity there is right now, and business is on its way back. It'll probably, I think a lot of companies have said, hey, we can save money. It may not be altruistic in the sense of being climate motivated, but more just saving money from the bottom line. They don't need to travel as much because they can leverage all forms of video communication and the like for calling on clients and et cetera. But the trajectory of air travel is going to continue to go up, and I love the notion of flying like a nerd, but it's really tough. I mean, to avoid flights in the first place. I mean, I think it's a cool idea, but I don't know what kind of impact that's going to have. Can you comment a little bit more on the electric, the electric planes? I did, one time Google Airbus, and they seem to have a pretty broad-based initiative. I don't know if it's more PR than reality, but I mean, they look like they're really designing some large aircraft. And how viable is that vis-a-vis the syn fuels approach as a real alternative? I saw you had a number up there, like 27% could be in that alternative design, but.
Yeah, and I'll go back to well, I guess I don't have any real stats on the electric planes, but yeah, so electric planes, I think what you want to look at if you see articles about electric plane startups or Airbus has a new design is to just look at whether the money's flowing, right? Because Airbus, it is kind of PR to some degree. And so there are cases, though, where there's actually money being invested. So JetBlue, for example, United now, EasyJet, they have venture capital parts of their organizations, or they have a huge innovation fund, one or the other. And they invest in these electric plane startups. So they've really done some research about who they're going to go with, and they're trying to make it happen. So I think that those are the projects that I look to. I think that I can't remember where Airbus is and who, which airlines might be invested in that or not off the top of my head. But some of them are kind of PR because they have the story starts out with this beautiful picture of this futuristic plane, right? And I mean, those stories have been going around for about 20 years, right? So it's really important to look at what's happening with the investment. Gotcha.
Hey, Mark, you got your hand raised?
I do, thank you. Thank you, Brad. Some interesting content. I have a question, and sorry if this comes across as a little forward, but I'm wondering if there's room in the discussion to take a micro view in terms of flying today being the most carbon intensive activity we could do on the planet, particularly taking a discretionary flight. And I'm wondering if there's room for shame in this discussion, because from what I understand, the average global carbon output from an average citizen on the planet is about 4,000 or 4 tons. And one flight to Europe with a couple of stopovers is 4 tons. And I just wonder how, it just strikes me that a lot of what you presented was kind of greenwashing for a really incredibly devastating industry. And is there room to talk about, this is the worst thing you can do for the future of your kids for any discretionary purpose? And I understand there's emergency flights for whatever, for business, a funeral, what have you. But should we just be telling people, do not take discretionary flights until the industry solves this problem? And I don't know if maybe we start with a carbon fee and dividend, and we have the true cost of the damage we're doing to the planet by flying. I haven't flown for 5 years. I used to, like Charlie, I used to fly a lot. I feel really bad that I did that. And I love the convenience of travel by air as much as anybody, but I really think this discussion needs to be a lot more severe than it has been.
Yeah. So I think in Europe it's especially more severe, right? I think the pandemic, it changed a lot of the discussion on flying because it just wasn't happening anymore, and there were honestly a lot of other things going on, right? So I mean, Greta Thunberg, I think that she's often sort of the face of the fly shame movement in Europe. And so in Sweden, fly shame really caught on around 2018, 2019, I think 2019. And it was the first time that there was actual demonstrated evidence that a campaign like that could reduce revenues from airlines. So, 2019, you started to see some European airlines change their sustainability policies and start to buy more aviation fuels and start to speak more authentically about their carbon problem. Because you did have this flight shame movement in Europe. That has not really caught on like it did in Europe. I think it could catch on. I don't know when it would catch on in the US, just because, you know, we're still coming out of COVID and there's a lot of other issues going on right now. And I actually don't know if there's many US NGOs that are working on that. There are in Europe. There are in Europe where they're starting up sort of the flight shame movement again. But again, it's a little bit slow. I'm not sure if it's going to catch on for another few months or maybe a year. So hopefully that answered your question a little bit, Mark.
Well, I guess I'm wondering more specifically for you, would you be willing to put a slide in that talks about this is a personal choice, and a devastatingly personal choice, to take a discretionary flight, and it does produce, say, a round trip flight to Europe is 4 tons.
Yeah.
The average person's output on the planet is 4 tons. So it's a very selfish thing to do today.
Yeah.
I think it would be nice to see that in your presentation. You know,
one thing, just in the interest of time, Brad, are you able to stay a few minutes past the bottom of the hour?
Yeah.
Great.
Oh,
So
yeah,
I think there's a lot more questions. So we've got a 10-minute presentation from Brick Feevold, who's one of our climate reality leaders, and right after that with a question or two for him, and then we can just jump right back into this little past the hour. So if you don't mind. Hey, Brick, you ready to share?
Sure.
All right, it's all yours.
Thank you. As promised, this is a short talk, and I don't think I'll take the full 10 minutes. We've been discussing a little bit about electric vehicles and the batteries and the limitations. So I wanted to just bring this to light and bring awareness to this conversation about climate change on the behind the scenes impacts of electric vehicles that still doesn't have good solutions yet for resolving the issue. And in this case, I've framed the issue as the electric vehicle green dilemma. It's dirty lithium-based battery industry. And let me move the windows out of my way here. So the dilemma being, we all agree, of course, that replacing internal combustion engines is the right thing to do, and it drastically will reduce CO2 emissions globally. However, on the flip side, the mining of precious metals for the electric vehicle batteries contributes to a variety of negative impacts on the earth: habitat loss, wildlife harm, both surface and groundwater pollution, which includes some radioactive waste that can come from mining, as well as the social and racial injustice, not to mention the child labor abuse and various geopolitical inequities. And what I mean by that is essentially kind of the arms race of securing the resources for the electrification of the transportation sector in particular. The race between China and the United States and other countries to be able to secure these sources of lithium in particular, but other metals as well. And of course, lithium is we don't really have a good answer yet of how much lithium supply there is. It's a relatively ubiquitous mineral, but it's not that easy to locate in high abundance. So we don't know what the plan is moving too far ahead in the future. So some questions I'd like you all to consider while I'm sharing my points here is, first, does the ends, meaning the lower net carbon dioxide emissions, justify the means, essentially the high costs and effects of mining metals for electric vehicle batteries? And I'm thinking more of the passenger vehicle at this point, but it can go up into the airplanes as well as the industrial vehicles as well. Second question, what direction is the electrical vehicle battery industry heading? And as consumers, what influence can we have on industry and market ethics do the right thing? And if we can, how? And if not, then what do we do? How do we approach this particular dilemma? As consumers, how do we optimize our purchasing decisions to minimize net impact to the global environment? And the example of the A-NERD plan to flying is certainly one part of that solution, I think, coming up with those kinds of strategies. And finally, are there other options, issues, and dilemmas related to the electric vehicle explosion and high demand that we can expect that we should be considering? So I mentioned that electric vehicles are good. We all can agree on that. However, we understand that they're not always necessarily zero emissions. Emissions depends upon the energy source with which you charge up your battery within your system. So on the left-hand sidebar, there's San Jose, the city of San Jose in California, gives some guidance to consumers that, if you sign up with certain programs, et cetera, you can limit your emissions down to 0%. However, as you scale to incorporate different types of energy sources, you could end up contributing quite a bit of CO2 emissions with a hybrid vehicle, for example. And the national averages certainly demonstrates that all electric vehicle is the way to go. And the pie chart essentially indicates how that changes and what proportion based on the sources of the energy used to charge your vehicle. So I'm going to address those two first questions in very brief. So does the ends justify the means in this case? What are some of the issues involved in the means? I'm not going to go through all of them, but I wanted to give just a taste of what we're facing when we are choosing to buy an electric vehicle. And of course, it's not only applied to electric vehicles, it's all of our battery operated devices that depend upon generally a lithium-based product to power them when you're not connected to the grid. There's a variety of lawsuits that are taking place as it relates to improper labor abuse. And we know that cobalt, the majority of cobalt actually comes out of the Congo. And there's a lot of unregulated aspects related to the sourcing of our lithium and cobalt industries. The impacts are quite detrimental, regardless of the region where the mining takes place. And of course, we also have the more direct environmental impacts as it relates to animals, in addition to the humans. But the legal and illegal mining of these precious minerals contributes significantly to biodiversity loss, habitat loss for other critters as well, and creates a dilemma when you create these environments where there's dependence upon local wildlife for food as well as for shelter and the wood fuel for cooking. And the gorilla is used here as essentially a poster child, but it can be applied to many areas. And in the States here, we have proposed mining that's proposed in Nevada that's going to impact sage grouse and a variety of other species that utilize those habitats. So cobalt and lithium mining, it is a global issue. In the Southwest, in the West, in Nevada, there are racial injustices that are taking place. There's a lot of emphasis on, using federal lands, which oftentimes are usurped Native American lands, tribal lands, and they're attempting to plan long-term mining of lithium products and other minerals from them. So the second question I wanted to bring up and address here is, what direction electric vehicle battery industry heading? I don't have all the answers or all the facts related to this, and I want to continue exploring this. And I hope that there's some feedback from all of you where you may have some other examples to provide here. But is there a greener future for the electric vehicle? And some of my recent research through internet sources and trying to track down some of the main reports is that there is I'm more optimistic than I was a week ago or 2 weeks ago. And that these different companies, including US-based GM as well as Ford and and other industries are coming up with alternatives to the cobalt-based battery. GM, for example, is using an Ultium battery that is fortunately fully recyclable through a Canadian firm that they've set up contracts with that's called Li-Cycle. I have not dug into the behind the scenes business practices of Li-Cycle yet at this point, so stay tuned on that. But it is promising to know that there is advanced recycling that is taking place. And there's also cobalt-free batteries. IBM and, as I mentioned, Ford has nickel-cadmium batteries for its new Ford unit. So there are certainly options where we're moving forward to having at least the impacts related to cobalt for electric vehicles being reduced. It doesn't mean that cobalt mining will stop, obviously. So the chart on the right shows that there's a lot of different metals that are associated with the development of batteries. And all of them have their place in the current market, but what we don't have a good handle on is the ground-to-ground recycling of all of these products. So the lithium-ion battery market projections are quite substantial. So in gigawatt hours, it goes up to 1,525 gigawatt hours of projected use for the lithium-ion, and we can only imagine that curve is going to be continuing to increase. And however, we haven't fully identified all of the sources for this lithium supply. One research group, the Lute Augsburg Research Group, which is a partnership between Finland and Germany, they did some forecast scenarios. They had actually 8 forecasted scenarios, and I'm only showing 2 of them here. And one of them is the high end and another is the low end. And they made some assumptions, like all the models do provide. And they made one prediction that at the high end, assuming that there's 73 metric tons of lithium global supply, using best policies in recycling, and with the assumption that there's a lot of electric vehicles on the road, in this case, 3 billion. And I'm not sure if it's a reasonable high estimate. But if that is the case, that particular model prediction indicates that the lithium supply may be depleted in a few years beyond 2100, which really isn't that far ahead of time. And of course, the low end, if we have really only 26 metric tons of lithium global supply, and we continue status quo with our recycling of our batteries, then we may be depleted much before then. So that's not very good news. And so we have lots of considerations to be able to lots of solutions and alternative strategies to think about on how we can improve this process before we can think of the electric vehicle as a solution beyond 2100 in this case. So the last 3 questions, which I haven't addressed, I do want to take some time here. This is my last slide, and so I want to ask you if you can, come up with some ways to address these questions in our Q&A, and feel free to address any of the first 2, but I'd like to hear from all of you, and I'd like to come back to this topic at a later time in one of our meetings and to describe some of the more advanced market technologies that have emerged over the next couple of years. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Brick. That was well done. Well done.
I'll leave the questions up just in case you want.
Yeah. Anybody have any specific?
I got one.
So I'm going to answer the first question and say that yes, the ends justify the means. Even with the climate question totally removed from it, and for the simple reason of air pollution. I remember growing up, you're waiting for the bus, you're outside waiting to get on the bus, and you're breathing in nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate pollution from these diesel engines that has a very demonstrable impact, like leads to more cases of asthma, heart conditions, all kinds of stuff. So just for the public health reason alone, I think electrifying is worth it. Brick, you did such a good job like teasing out the tension about this, because it is a human rights issue in a lot of places in the world, and we don't have good mining practices in the DRC, and there's questions about how much we can really get. So I think, I think carbon neutral fuels might be able to answer some of those questions in the future, just like I think they're going to answer some of the questions about aviation. But we're going to have to be able to produce them so cheaply, because I really believe that what we need here is the impossible burger of climate change solutions, where it tastes pretty much the same, but it's just a tiny fraction of the environmental damage. And I think that we could potentially get there with carbon neutral fuels if we can produce them high temperature steam. But we're going to be talking about that a lot more in next month's meeting, because that is the expertise of the guest that I've brought in to speak to us, named Eric Ingersoll. So yeah, all right, I'll get off. I'll give the microphone back now. But that's my thought. I didn't look at the second question, but maybe somebody else has thoughts on that.
Anybody have anything for Brick at all? And we're bumping up against the bottom of the hour. Before I jump back into the Q&A, I just want to remind everybody that our next meeting is Wednesday, August 11th, and kind of echoing what Eric said, our main speaker is going to be Eric Ingersoll. He's a senior advisor for the Energy Options Network, and he's going to be talking about decarbonizing flight and the rest of transportation. So I think it's a great follow-on theme to both of these presentations today. But having said that, we're at the bottom of the hour. Everybody's welcome to stay on. I think, hey, Brick, you can stop sharing, I think, at this point, and people feel free to speak up and ask your questions of Brad and or comments, and same with Brick. So,
Brad, first I'd like to ask if you're okay with us posting this recording online.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, thank you. Then I had a follow-up question. You're talking about modal shifts. Would that include things like high-speed rail? And for domestic flights, what's the relative advantage of high-speed rail like they're doing in China versus the carbon output of airlines?
I don't know the exact, sort of tons of carbon difference between, train and plane. It's going to depend on a lot of factors, right? The electricity of the grid and all of that. Yeah, I mean, there's a certain point at which, well, I think actually high-speed rail, if you can extend it all the way across the country, I mean, that'd be great. But we don't have that situation here, right? So, or in the U.S., except for on the eastern seaboard right now, where you could, I mean, so a good example is taking a flight from Washington D.C. to New York makes no sense at all, right? Because there's plenty of trains that fly back and forth. Now I have to take a flight to Europe. Going across the United States, from like New York to San Francisco, like it's harder. Like there's more of a burden. In Europe, they have a very different situation, where they have an interconnected train system that stretches across. So yeah, I mean, it could also mean switching to car too in certain cases. There's certain calculators that can help you make good decisions about whether you take a flight or train or car. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for you, Brad. And this follows up from Steve's chat question about the challenge of trying to coordinate the type of plane that you would book on your air travel.
Yeah.
And I can see how I would do that when I do the initial booking, because you can look through and see the plane models, et cetera. So then you can do a little bit of Google research to find out about that model. However, as my wife just experienced going down to Mexico, it was that American Airlines switched her. She probably had, 4 different changes in her itinerary before she even got there. And so she had no control essentially over those choices. Is it practical to try to pick your airplane?
Yeah, I mean, with these types of things, there's only so much you can do, right? And so, I mean, at least we have some ability to, search and see what airplane we were flying and seeing if it's direct and that sort of thing. But you don't have a lot of control once you're out there. And yeah, they can switch the aircraft on you. I mean, even to get even more granular on this, you don't know if the 737 is the most efficient 737, right? I mean, and so, I've talked to some companies about this recently who, they're trying to reduce. So a good example is like, let's just say Microsoft. They're actually quite a good example because they do have a strategy where they're trying to reduce business flights. They're trying to track the data of their employees and to understand how to, bring their carbon footprint down across a lot of different parts of their footprint, but particularly aviation. And it's really hard for them to do that because the data, they don't have real data. The airlines don't give them real data. It's modeled, and the data that it's modeled on is very bad. So it's like these little things really, even frustrate the most sophisticated of businesses, right? So yeah, I mean, there needs to be pressure on the booking systems. There needs to be pressure on the airlines to disclose data. There could be some interesting announcements in the next few months. I have some colleagues, not in WWF, but in other organizations that are working on this. But it's interesting because just in preparation for this, I checked a few travel sites to see if you're able to sort by CO2. In some travel booking systems, you can select sort by cost, sort by all these sorts of things. You could sort by CO2. You can't do that on Kayak anymore. Like I just checked last night, and you can't do it. You could about I think about a year ago, right? So, I mean, they just took that away, right? So these things are kind of fluid. Apparently, customers didn't care about that. I don't know why Kayak made that decision. I mean, so there's a lot of change, sort of fluctuation, I think, with the booking systems here. And I don't think that they're hearing loudly from customers, though. I think they're starting to hear it a little bit more from businesses. But there's, the tools are still not there yet to help us make good decisions, unfortunately. Cheryl?
Thank you.
You raise your hand.
Thanks to both of you for those interesting presentations. I learned a lot. Brad, I'm just wondering, like Delta, Mark, this sort of goes back to your question about flying at all. When you can go onto Delta, into their website, it's not easy to find and pay an upcharge that's to cover your carbon. So they plant trees or whatever they do. Do you think those are really worth doing, or is it all just marketing hype and more revenue for them?
I think there is a certain marketing aspect to it. I think we can say. I was talking earlier that some of these projects might not be as robust as they should be in terms of the measurements. I mean, there have been a string of articles that have been coming out in the media, not necessarily entirely accurate in all aspects, but talking about the issue of carbon credits or carbon offsets. And the story generally goes that they talk to a farmer or someone whose land is being protected, and the farmer says something like, well, I would have done this anyways, right? So, I mean, there are these challenges with quantification. I wouldn't say that all of them are all carbon credits are bad. I mean, one project that we have going on with a couple other organizations is assessing the market, the quality in the market of carbon credits right now, in order to try to drive higher quality projects out there, because they're growing. I mean, the market for these projects are growing. So we feel like we do need to influence the quality in a good direction. but yeah, so it's kind of both. I mean, I think that, yeah, it's a little bit of marketing, but they can be impactful if you're buying the right project.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a follow-up, I guess, to that on carbon credits. Brad, can you recommend, if you had to choose one, is there one carbon offset market that you would recommend that we invest in if we do travel? And
It's a good question. So it's part of why we're doing this project,
okay,
because there's not good advice out there in the market. I think that what we often will say within WWF is to look at gold standard as a standard for credits. So you can look for gold standard credits in a lot of there's several brokers and carbon offsetting platforms that are out there that will sell those credits. So that's a good place to start. But even credits accredited under that standard, there is a risk, and there's an inherent risk with all projects that they might not be fully additional. Right? This concept of additional, that they may have happened without that finance, right? You don't necessarily ever really know, but there's ways that you can test it in test projects, and that's what we're trying to push. We're trying to make sure that these tests that project developers and the standards themselves that certify these credits are doing a better job. So.
Thank you.
Can I ask one more, just kind of related to that, about maybe a carbon fee dividend as a good opportunity to get everyone thinking about what that particular activity produces in terms of carbon?
Yeah. So yeah, you're asking me about the policy mechanism of a carbon fee dividend. Yeah.
Can I interject and ask? I'm not real sure what the difference is between a carbon dividend and a carbon offset credit. Is there a difference?
I think Mark, so carbon fee would be carbon tax, like you're paying a certain price per carbon, and then the revenue that the government generates from that is reinvested back to
got it. Okay.
Back to people, right?
Yep, exactly. But I think the fee is paid by the producer.
It is, yeah. Yes, yeah. I mean, there are some things that are talked about. I don't think it's made it into any bills, but a few years ago, some NGOs, including us on this, recommended having some sort of frequent flyer tax as a way to sort of deter, excessive use of aircraft or of aviation, or private jet taxation too. That's another probably would be very popular, kind of a populist approach there. Not sure exactly what. I don't know if that's actually been modeled. Probably wouldn't give you that much carbon benefit, but it would probably be popular. So there's a couple other policy mechanisms potentially.
Hey, Brad, do you have any data around impact of space travel, for example? All the recent,
I'm not deep into the technology there. What I've heard anecdotally is, it's not very carbon efficient. Obviously, but I mean, the higher you go, the more you're going to need to spend in terms of fuel. So what we just saw with Richard Branson going into space, the other aircraft or spacecraft that will launch after that, they're going to have to go higher. So those will even be more carbon inefficient, right? So yeah, it's a bit worrisome. I mean, we've just been watching supersonics, for the last few years, and now we have to contend with space travel suddenly, right? It feels it feels a little strange, right? It you know, it's kind of going in the opposite direction. I don't think it's you know, I hope it doesn't get to scale.
Yeah, and unfortunately, you know, all of it right now, all the hype is around completely discretionary space travel. It's all about space tourism, which is crazy. You know?
Absolutely. Crazy. Yeah. It makes no sense. Makes no sense.
Well, again, thank you very much, Brad and Brick. You know, I thought a lot of good thought-provoking questions and such. We probably could keep going on. Feel free, everybody. I do have to depart, but again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Brad,
Yeah.
this was great.
Yeah, that was great. Appreciate it, Brad. Thanks, Brick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brick. Have a good night.
We'll see you later, everyone.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
guys.
Bye.
Now,